Love him or hate him, Boris Johnson, the UK Prime Minister, has resigned. Scandal after scandal, he survived the knockout punches, but the mass resignations were just too many, practically leaving him without a cabinet to run the country. The drama may not be over, since there are still those who want him to leave power immediately and not stay on until October, when a leadership race will determine who will be the next Prime Minister. In this edition of The Spotlight, we will look at Johnson's legacy, how he improved or hurt the UK, and what guarantees there are that the next UK Prime Minister or his cabinet or her cabinet will be any better. First, let me introduce our guest for this edition of The Spotlight. Professor of Economics and political commentator Rodney Shakespeare joins us from London. Also joining us, journalist and commentator James Tweedy, who joins us from Plymouth in the UK. Welcome to you both. What a 48 hours it has been, Rodney Shakespeare. Let me first start with you. And looking at the British Prime Minister resignation, of course, the rebellion that came from the Conservatives, unhappy with the scandals, as we understand, surrounding his premiership. Do you think that this was just all about the scandals, or perhaps somebody had an eye on his post or his position, and maybe something went on in that respect, which amounted to all these resignations, which we understand were over 60 at this point?
It's much worse than the immediate scandals, like the cost of the wallpaper in the Downing Street flat, like not telling the truth about what he knew about someone he appointed to a government post, about the sad situation in which there were parties when other people could not be with their dying relatives. Behind this are two great big things, in which was catching the Conservatives and which is going to catch Labour and the Liberals, the whole political establishment. The first is, and you can go back, say, to 2008, is that certain malfunctions in the economy not understood, and their attempts to overcome them meant that they were pumping money and not addressing the problems. And the inflation was rising before the business in Ukraine. That is going on and has been accentuated by Ukraine, and none of them have an answer. They try and raise interest rates, they will collapse the economy. Now, the second thing going on, and they're all complicit in this, it's gone on for 25 years. Say 1997, when, breaking an agreement, of course, the West started to expand NATO to the east. Russia wasn't strong enough to do anything. But the purpose of moving thousands of kilometers to the east was to put hypersonic nuclear missiles right up against Russia. And of course, Russia is never allowed to have hypersonic nuclear missiles right against the USA. You then come to 2014, when there was a fascist coup. And I'll tell you what they're not telling you. The coup overthrew a democratically elected president and put into power fascist Ukrainian-speaking Ukrainians whose policy was and is to kill Russian-speaking Ukrainians. Now, the whole of the British political establishment is committed to that fascist regime, which, by the way, has got rid of all the political parties in Ukraine. Don't talk to me about democracy there. Mm-hmm. The whole of the political establishment in the UK is committed to an understanding of economics and finance to which they have no solution. I got my energy bills today. I won't tell you. They were eye-watering. And at the same time, they are locked in like a train which cannot slow down into this Ukrainian policy, which they are making worse. And even today, the Americans are going to put more sanctions on Iran to stop Iranian oil coming into the market. They're locked into disaster. It goes through all the political parties in the UK, and I'm afraid the whole situation is going to get worse.
Well, that's not very promising, is it?
We
were going to get into the economic side of this whole thing a little bit later on, which I'm going to leave for a little bit later on, so I can get an immediate reaction from you, if I may, James Tweedy, about just the whole affair here of what has transpired. I mean, things really, in UK politics, no one would have really thought that this would happen in the course of the past 24, 48 hours in the way that it did. Looking at some of the reactions, Nicola Sturgeon is what I'd like to ask from you, the First Minister of the first Scottish Minister. She said it is just an unsustainable proposition to say that he's going to continue to inhabit number 10. I'm not sure anybody could look at Boris Johnson and conclude that he is capable of genuinely behaving as a caretaker Prime Minister. Why do you think there's such a push? It's not just her saying that. Why do you think there's this approach towards Johnson, like what we're seeing from Nicola Sturgeon?
It's like Mr. Shakespeare said. It's about the economic crisis. It's not really about one of his MPs going to a private members club with other Tory MPs and other Tory party members, and getting drunk and touching two of them up. It's that's not even Johnson's fault that the man behaved like that. It's because of the country's in crisis. You've got the crisis of rampant inflation. Inflation heading towards 11% soon. Because of the sanctions that, it's all self-inflicted. It's because of the sanctions that we've put on Russia and the oil and gas embargo we've put on Russia. And things like, household utilities, household gas and electricity, and filling up your car, the prices of those things are doubling. So this is the real problem. This is what's making the government unpopular. But like Mr. Shakespeare said, there's nobody who wants to change that. Nicola Sturgeon, a couple of months ago, called for a no-fly zone over the Ukraine, a NATO-imposed no-fly zone. Boris Johnson said that would lead to World War III. So Nicola Sturgeon is not a serious person. Her whole, her whole focus is on trying to rerun the independence referendum that she failed to win, or her party failed to win, back in 2014, and nobody wants that. And this is the thing. So this leads into one of the reasons why Johnson is probably going to be able to stay on, because his party, they've done what happened to him was normal in the Conservative Party. Exactly the same thing happened to Theresa May. That's why Boris Johnson became leader and Prime Minister. The same thing happened to Margaret Thatcher. They all survived a no confidence vote by the backbenchers. But then, things got worse, the crisis got worse, and people came to have a quiet word with them, and they resigned. Or people, some ministers resigned and spoke out against them. That happened to Thatcher. So, but now what? Now where are they going? Well, he's staying on. Now people say that's it's untenable or it's weird. Well, okay, someone's got to be Prime Minister until the new one is elected, which is also normal. It's normal to change Prime Ministers like that in Britain. And the alternative, the only way they've got to get rid of him if they don't like it is to have a parliamentary no confidence vote, which means an immediate, in the government, not in him, but in the government, which means an immediate snap general election. And if that happens, firstly, as things stand with the party's popularity, a lot of those MPs, those Conservative MPs, would lose their seats and their lucrative jobs in that election. And then you would end up probably, most likely, with a hung parliament with Labour, maybe as the largest party, forming a coalition with the Liberal Democrats and the Scottish National Party. And the SNP would demand another referendum. And in fact, they'll demand one every parliament, or every couple of years even, until Scottish people get bored of it and vote to leave the UK, possibly, or just get rid of, stop voting for the Scottish National Party, perhaps.
Okay.
But see, that's probably a non-starter. And again, as Mr. Shakespeare said, it's very hard to see any of the potential candidates, because two of the Two of the favourites are Ben Wallace, the Defence Secretary, and Liz Truss, the Foreign Secretary, who are both the leading proponents of the war, even more, as much as Johnson or more so, the war in Ukraine, or back in Ukraine in its war against Russia. And they're not going to change policy. They're not going to change the policy that's causing the basic problem of inflation.
Sure. Well, I mean, where can I start with this whole affair, Rodney Shakespeare, of the unstable situation that the government is facing? I mean, can it be called a government at this point? I mean, we're looking at October being the date that there's going to be a passover from the caretaker PM to whoever is going to get picked. But what's going to happen until then? I mean, we know the state of affairs in the UK, as you just said. The cost of energy is so high. Your electric bill, you can't even mention it because it brought tears to your eyes or made your eyes water. I mean, how is this government going to even function, especially given the fact you got 60 ministers who have resigned, even though there's been a new cabinet that's already put in place from what we understand?
James referred to a confidence motion, and he also said, or indicated, that that won't happen because those Conservative MPs will lose their seats. There's another possibility. The Prime Minister is the Queen's Prime Minister. And it is conceivable that a quiet word would suggest to Boris that he should go. But that the Queen must have a Prime Minister. And I believe that Theresa May, I think, is indicating that she's not willing. So the chances are that Boris will stay as Prime Minister until the Conservatives get themselves organised. As regards who will come through, the trouble is you've got a whole batch of second-rate candidates. And just do a thought experiment. Who can you think of who could have a raft of new policy to solve the problems, who could unite the Conservative Party, and who could appeal to the whole of the country, and who is able to rethink major policy, e.g. on sanctions on Ukraine, and you can't think of anyone. So there's the problem for the Conservative Party. This is going to drag on, the situation is going to get worse, British politics is going to go into a sort of melting point as these big issues, as James is indicating, as these big issues start to play and have more obvious effect.
Well, since we've talked about the Ukraine conflict, I have to ask you, James Tweedy, about what the Russian ambassador to the UK has said. And he said that Boris Johnson's fall was just a reward for what he said a belligerent anti-Russian policy of support for Ukraine, while ignoring the economic needs of the British people. That he concentrated too much on the geopolitical situation on Ukraine. Do you think he had a point?
Yeah, that's justifiable. That's what both of us have been saying so far. And others have said, some bloggers like Larry Johnson, who's an American conservative but anti-war blogger, Andrei Martyanov, who's a Russian who lives and works in the US, that this is just going to be the start. Johnson isn't going to be the first Prime Minister or President to go because of this. Over in the States, Joe Biden is facing defeat in the midterm elections in November, and then his future starts to look uncertain. Everywhere, people can see that he's not compos mentis. He's losing his marbles. In France, Emmanuel Macron, the president, has lost his governing majority in Parliament, and the parties that picked up seats were the national, what they call it, the National Rally now, it used to be the National Front, and a coalition of left-wing parties led by Jean-Luc Mélenchon, and both of those are against the war and essentially against NATO membership, and so on. And it will, and there are other governments. The Dutch government is very vulnerable because they've decided to bankrupt, to bankrupt the farming industry in their country on some pretext of ecological reasons, and the farmers have have blocked all the motorways, and you can't get food into the supermarkets, and that's spreading to Belgium now. So all these governments are going to start coming down because the whole of Europe is in crisis. You see, and the ambassador is justified in that, and it's not going to, this is just the beginning.
Sure. What is this committee that's going to, at this point, Rodney Shakespeare perhaps rule on the fact that it's not going to take, it shouldn't take 1 year for a vote of confidence to take place, and that's going to get reduced? I mean, is that the way that, isn't that another way of saying that there won't be enough time for a person who comes into a position to be able to perform, and therefore, with the shortened length of time, that the other party members may say, it's time for this person to go, let's bring on the next person, in a sense. Is that where UK politics is headed to?
Well, on the surface it is, but what is coming is the winter and further increased prices, and particularly out of control energy prices. And James is referring to political events right the way around the world, and they all seem to be slightly different. But in fact, the big factors that we've discussed are all playing there. So in British politics, you're going to have to look at the situation, maybe, shall we say, at the beginning of winter. I mean, look at what's going to happen in Germany at the beginning of winter. I mean, the EU is crashing its own economies. Germany, the great powerhouse, its industry is going to be smashed at the beginning of winter. And ordinary people are going to have a tough time as well. So these are the big things, and there's no answer to it. I don't want you to think in terms of, British politics will carry on. We'll just have another prime minister and they'll have majority of 80. The situation is capable, and I think likely, to get very sharply worse, inflation-wise, heating-wise, politics in different countries. They're all starting to attack and start to put pressure on their governments. All this is going to get worse September, October, November.
Well, what type of monetary policies, what type of economic direction can the UK then take, given the state that it is in right now, James Tweedy, moving forward until you get the new Prime Minister into his post, who then is going to perhaps try to see what direction it's going to go with the UK? Because at this point, this government is not going to make those major decisions as relayed by the Prime Minister and other members.
No, I mean, Johnson has said that he's not going to make any big policy changes because he's going, out of deference to whoever takes over from him. Big policy changes. Okay. What needs to happen is that the UK needs to drop its oil and gas embargoes on Russia. It needs to negotiate with Russia and then start buying oil and gas as much as they can get. It would need to persuade its European neighbours to do the same. The USA is already cheating on its own sanctions. It's still importing oil from Russia, but and leaving US to leaving Europe to leaving their tanks to run dry, basically. So they've got to persuade the rest of the European Union and NATO countries to do the same. So just get the market so that there isn't an unusually high demand in the market elsewhere. Things like that, and then it's got to negotiate with Russia and give them back all the assets that they seized and things like that in return for the things. And it's going to mean dropping support for Ukraine, and of course they need to persuade, change course completely, make a U-turn and persuade Volodymyr Zelensky to make a peace deal with the Russians, with the Russian government. And then of course, what's been going on in the last couple of years, because this is one of the things that meant that Boris Johnson's got very little to show for his 3 years as Prime Minister, is that we had the COVID pandemic, and people were told to stay at home and not work, but they were paid, they 80% of their wages or whatever were paid by the government while they were doing that. So people had money to spend, but no, but things weren't being produced in the same quantity as before. Work wasn't getting done, and prices of everything shot up. And people was taking that money and spending. They couldn't go on holiday, so they were spending it on home improvements. And you couldn't find a builder or a decorator. They all had like 2-year waiting lists, and they couldn't find enough materials. They couldn't find cement. I had some guy working on my roof. I managed to get him round, luckily, but he had a hard time getting the cement. And so it's great. You need to get more productive industries going. And there needs to be production, real economy. That's Russia's advantage. Real economy. Right. It has it is the biggest producer of several commodities that every country needs, and every industry, every country
only realize that
heavy industry needs. This is the sort of thing Britain needs to be doing, and it needs to be buying stuff in and getting the supply way higher than demand and bringing those prices down. And
let me jump in, since we're just out of time practically here, and give Rodney Shakespeare the final question. Under a minute, if you can, Rodney Shakespeare. What do you think about the way that the UK is going to carry on with the EU in terms of whoever that's going to come in? Will it reduce these post-Brexit tensions when it comes to the way that the UK is going to interact with the EU?
No, the tensions are going to get worse. The situation over the UK breaking the agreement, that's going Northern Ireland. The Northern Ireland Unionists have been shoved under a bus. That situation is going to get worse. Yes, you've got to get rid of those sanctions, but the EU are more set on increasing the sanctions and doing preposterous things, like thinking that you can cut the price of the oil that you buy from Russia. And these are nonsense things. The whole thing is locked into going worse. And I'm going to make a rule for you, which is quite simple. Anything the Conservatives do now and in the near future will make the situation worse.
All right, we're going to leave it there. Thank you very much for that. Rodney Shakespeare, Professor of Economics and political commentator from London, and also James Tweedy, thank you, from Plymouth in the UK, journalist and commentator. With that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. From me, Takway, and the team, this is goodbye until next time.